So my talk is entitled Arable Lands, Lost Lands, Tenure, Food and Urbanization in Egypt. Land is a finite resource, and agrarian land even more so. And there's only a certain amount of available fertile land in the world to feed us, some 48 million square kilometers. Multiple forces play upon fertile land, and there are several reasons why agrarian land is lost, such as desertification, degradation, transport infrastructure, increased feed, fiber, and fuel production, and among these, urbanization is a prevalent and destructive one. Illuminating the relationship between land tenure, agriculture, and urbanization, Egypt is a useful case study of this manifestation. In Egypt, too, agricultural land is a scarce resource with 3.2 million hectares available for food production. Comparatively similar in population, Germany cultivates 18 million hectares. Most of these irrigated fields are located on the Nile Valley, which is also home to 80 million people. The total area of arable land available is currently 0.05 hectares per capita, which is the lowest ratio of agricultural land per person in Africa. Yet, Egyptian agriculture is extremely productive, with harvest 2 or 3 times a year. And ownership of agrarian land and control over farming forces stands the constant object of political struggles throughout centuries and in the past decades. In fact, the attempts of the state and its rulers to oversee land resources via agricultural production and ownership have been recurrent throughout Egyptian history, where state intervention, colonial agriculture, and agrarian policies and land reforms can be traced. This narrative also explains the constant desire for Egyptian politicians, at least since the 1950s, to launch massive land reclamation projects in the desert, with cultivated surfaces gained over desert land, as elsewhere on forests, savanna, or formerly fallow lands, with brutal adverse effects on biodiversity and sustainability. But even though decrease of arable land has been constant since then. For Egypt, the Nile waters are essential to agriculture and its management imperative to ensure local food production. The fine balance between appropriate irrigation and floods was a matter of life and death, and the security of water flows down the Nile is directly related to population's food security, something very clearly materialized by the Nilometer that you see here, which is 800 after Christ. And actually, you don't really see it, but the water level would indicate hunger, suffering, scarcity, abundance, and disaster again. So there is this kind of very small threshold where it's going to be okay. Prior to 1801, as documented in the French colonial report La Description de l'Égypte, floodwaters were channeled into reservoirs or irrigation waterways along fields, pumped by animal, human, and hydraulic forces. Distributed according to a complex hierarchy, the water was eventually released back to the river in an intricate mechanism called basin irrigation that allowed cultivation of one major crop a year. Under Ali Pasha, the modern ruler of Egypt, agriculture shifted from this basin irrigation to a perennial irrigation system in which the water is controlled so that it can be made to run into the land at regular intervals throughout the year via modern infrastructures. During this period, from the feudal 19th century until the end of the British occupation, with the upgrading of irrigation systems and the disciplining of farming populations, large agricultural estates emerge. With the creations of these large estates, especially those that brought former flood basins or wetlands under year-round cultivation, coercive farming flourished, and the owners required housing for the labor they used. On the vice-regal estates, landowners began to construct large number of organized villages in which, quote, the owner imposed on his tenants a plan where everything has its logical place, unquote, from Timothy Mitchell. Also to prevent laborers from leaving the land. In parallel, the British launched the Cadastral Survey of Egypt, recording every plot and the name of the owner, compiled into registers of landowners and their tax liabilities, and placed on maps. While the calculation of land areas and tax liabilities in the Nile Valley is perhaps the oldest continuous form of bureaucracy in the world, mapping property by British colonial forces announced what Timothy Mitchell calls new practices of calculation. Produced using triangulation methods, the register for each village in the country listed the land of the village by field and plot, and for each plot listed up to 25 items of information, including area, class of land, tax, owner, and occupier. The spatial presentation of land ownership made it impossible to record the same plot of land twice under different owners, and the map made immediately visible any plot of cultivated land that had not been registered under an owner and was thus evading taxation. Additionally, as most of the large estates emerged from top-down forces, the ruler or colonial powers, the mapping process, by regulating existing abnormalities, also erased the signs of the violence that could still be traced. Quoting Mitchell in Rule of Experts, the arbitrariness of large land ownership was merged into a uniform national space and made invisible. So the cadastral survey of Egypt also canceled knowledge of the village surveyors who marked out plot boundaries after the floods. So when the Nile would go up, they would be able to replace the plot boundaries and the property lines. And that actually corresponds also to the construction of the first Aswan Dam, which was located at the first Nile cataract at Aswan, 1,000 kilometers south of Cairo, financed by the Egyptian national budget under British supervision and built by British contractors with Egyptian labor force. The dam was to reorganize the distribution of expertise, taking away most of the local knowledge of flood basin irrigation distributed along the length of the river and concentrating technical control at one site. So the annual work of local surveyors was taken away. The mapping of the land in perspective with the infrastructural chronicle of the river materializes the will of controlling the land and containing the Nile from Muhammad Ali to the colonial powers. These new infrastructures paved the way for more ambitious and larger projects of major territorial significance toward an increasingly technocratic approach. One can agree that the political history of the Egyptian nation-state is linked to the irrigation of its soil and the river and the disciplining of its land ownership patterns. It is after the 1952 revolution and throughout the following 2 decades of Gamal Nasser's socialist rule that this appears even more strikingly with a series of important land reforms. By reassigning property, despite shortcomings, these succeeded in improving small farmers' rights and living conditions. Here you see a farmer holding Gamal Abdel Nasser's neck in gratitude and kissing his forehead, and a large crowd of farmers in the background. And all one sees from the president is his back, but you can see that he holds a piece of paper in his hand, which is actually a property title. And similar scenes were common throughout the 1950s, and they were well documented by press photography. The president would officially hand over tenure documents to male and female peasants at formal land redistribution ceremonies. This protocol indeed signaled the reallocation of agrarian land as a political issue of great saliency for the new regime. The first restriction of land ownership size was immediate, capping ownership to about 80 hectares per individual. The excess land was seized by the state and redistributed to landless peasants in plots of 1 to 2 hectares. Actually, this is fedans, but since you're not familiar with that, I will explain later. It's the stripes of the shape of the fields are actually called fedans. They're about almost a hectare a piece. So long-term public bonds compensated the owners. Land rents were controlled and could not exceed 7 times the basic land tax, which a measure that remained untouched until 1976, which over time resulted in rent freeze. Tenants were registered as holders and could not be evicted. In 1962, almost a decade after the first reform laws, the ceiling of ownership was reduced to 40 hectares. The state secured more land with further measures. Foreign owners were expropriated and prohibited to own agricultural land. Finally, a year before Nasser's death in 1969, the maximum land holding amount was reduced to 20 hectares. With this change, the land redistribution process came to an end. 700,054 fedans, so about 3,000 square kilometers, had been redistributed to 318,000 families. Just 13% of the arable land was redistributed to 10% of the rural populations. and scholars have argued that the top-down state-inspired and state-led reforms merely undermined upper classes while favoring rural middle classes. Perhaps the most relevant and positive consequences of the reforms should be measured in the larger context of Egypt. Big estates inherited from the feudal systems were eliminated, a decolonization of sorts. Cooperatives guaranteed equal access to agricultural inputs at fixed prices, and land lease conditions and preemption rights protected tenants. All of these measures resulted in the betterment of rural income and food production. Additionally, the reforms brought order to cultivated land, rents, and tenancy rights became regulated. Moreover, multiple layers of economic development and social change were addressed, resulting in a paradigm shift in the modest population's perception of the state as socially just. As a testimony to success, images of Nasser redistributing land still plaster the walls of farmers' homes across the country, and he remains a revered icon in rural Egypt. Nasser's changes were reversed by Western-oriented Anwar Sadat's doctrine Al-Infitah, the open door, and the liberalization years saw the implementation of aggressive neoliberal policies. There are no known images of Anwar Sadat being kissed by grateful peasants. In fact, Sadat himself established himself largely against Nasser's pro-rural policies. The change in ideology and economics he brought about reinforced the political strength of large landholders, rolling back Nasser's socialist legacy and land reforms. With his economic liberalization program, Sadat announced a complete break from state capitalism, Nasserism, and farmers were summoned to make improvements. Agriculture is also in need of a strong drive so as to keep pace with the sought rates of development. The same year, Law 69/1971 abolished the state's role of custodianship of the land, which resulted in 147,000 fedans confiscated and returned to dispossessed landowners. In 1978, Sadat announced the start of Egypt's Green Revolution, which focused set on developing new agricultural land rather than improving existing fertile areas. For the rural world, the Sadat years were marked by the dismantling of Nasser's strategy of redistributive justice, and the period inaugurated a long era of neglect concerning the existing agricultural areas. Successor Hosni Mubarak saw to market-led agrarian reforms, technicist agricultural policies favoring large-scale agribusinesses, and the land dispossession of smallholders and tenant farmers. From 1986 onward, the liberalization of markets and agricultural strategies aimed at the production of high-value crops for exports were implemented, encouraged by USAID and the World Bank. Throughout these processes of agricultural modernization, small-scale farmers were sidelined, while large landowners and agribusinesses located on reclaimed land areas benefited from state subsidies. In 1991, Egypt agreed with the IMF and the World Bank to implement the ERSAP, Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program, a set of aggressive economic reforms, public enterprise reform, market and trade liberalization, and private sector reforms. Over this wave of changes, the biggest impact on land tenure was the passing of Law 96 in 1992. This law overturned Nasser's rent control guarantees for tenants. The law was voted following intense lobbying by landowners who were members of the Mubarak government. The law stipulated the following: determining the rent has become freely done by both landlord and tenant, according to the principle of the law of the contractors, with the consequent result of freedom of the two parties to formulate the provisions of the contract. At the time, the 1 million tenants of the country had no political representative in parliament, and the media depicted them as, quote, lazy peasants abandoning the land, unquote. This constructed image and misrepresentation contributed to justifying the return of the land to destitute owners. The law was fully implemented in October 1997 after 5 years lapse. The effects on tenants' livelihoods were dramatic. Landless peasants, unable to afford a field to sustain their family, had to sell other assets. Children, mostly girls, were taken out of school, and child labor in large farms, which had been reduced during the Nasser years, reappeared. Subsistence farming activity increased, with farmers concentrating on food production for survival instead of cash crops. There was a sudden market increase in immigration to Arab countries and Europe. Violence against the state surged, with riots in several locations. In the long term, years of neglect led to a constant flow of rural migration to cities, sometimes temporarily, and increased pressure on affordable urban housing demand, a phenomenon that the state has failed to respond to. In January 2011, Tahrir Square was occupied for 18 days before the Mubarak regime fell. If the setting and the population involved were overwhelmingly urban, rural governorates were also represented on the square with tents. Demonstrations saw populations from the rural areas around Cairo marching to Tahrir.
Millions of Egyptians came down to the streets in nationwide protests.
This uprising defies any definitions.
People are gathering in the largest demonstrations against President Hosni Mubarak.
قرار السيد الرئيس محمد حسني مبارك بالتخلي عن منصب رئيس الجمهورية.
So the demise of Mubarak was symbolically charged, prompting political action in the rural world. Across the country, a collective grassroots movement towards reclaiming land tenure characterized the revolution. Farmers organized themselves in order to reclaim plots from large landowners who had evicted them. Independent, unrecognized unions flourished, objecting to corrupted state officials and the irrigation access and land boundaries. When Mohamed Morsi came to power, farmers were also expecting some institutional changes from the government with reservation. Rural populations hoped for a reversal of Mubarak's policies, even though they were distrustful of the Muslim Brotherhood who had previously sided with landowners. In fact, after Mohamed Morsi came to power as the candidate for the Brotherhood, changes in tenure laws did not happen. On the contrary, when Small Farmers Union proposed that the Morsi government should cancel Law 96 from 1992, Mahmoud Javda, spokesman at the time for the Economic Committee of the Party for Freedom and Justice, the Muslim Brotherhood's party, refused to amend the law and said, "It is unacceptable, intellectually or legally, for the tenant to share ownerships of the land with its owner." The liberalization of the land market and erosion rights suffered by the farmers of Egypt were not overturned during the revolution, nor with Morsi's short-lived presidency, leaving people with this impression. The revolution was good, but the dream of freedom, social justice, and human dignity has not been fulfilled. Under the presidency of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the last and current period is marked by the reassertion of military power over internal affairs, the enduring capitalization of large-scale agriculture, the neglect of rural population, and the acceleration of farmland loss to urbanization. Egypt's small farmer left in the dust by Sisi's agricultural project, reads a recent headline of the Middle Eastern newspaper Al-Monitor, referring to Sisi's 1.5 million Fedan project, a major land reclamation scheme for the Farafra, Matru, and New Valley governorates, launched in December 2015. Some of the major elements of the current governmental attitude towards land tenure and rural populations are encapsulated in this apparently innocuous article. Military forces and private landowning firms are the first beneficiaries of public rural investments, rather than farmers of the Nile Delta and the Valley. Farmers of the existing fertile so-called old lands, the majority, are totally absent from this project. The prevalence of the military over processes of land allocation and development project is a central feature of the current regime. The case of Egypt illustrates the historical process of depeasantization and the destruction of a local food system, exemplified in this spatial conflict between cities and their food systems. Some experts have said that Egypt loses an estimated 11,000 hectares of agricultural land every year. This is an illegal construction incrementally built on agrarian land. It is representative of the physical fabric generated by informal housing production. It also epitomizes the competition for land use between agriculture and urbanization. This is a map from the traditions from Cairo, and here on the right side, it's the formal city, let's say planned city. It's the area of Mohandisin around 1970. And here you see urbanization creeps in. Is this working? Wow. Here you see the urbanizations already starting to creep in onto this Fedan, onto the farmland, and this is the area today. And despite its importance for local food security, arable land is disappearing under the destructive forces of urbanization, pushed by lack of affordable housing and rural migration, as liberalization processes have rendered agriculture less and less profitable and fragilized the rural population. This restructuration of territory emerged in this new urban form that mirrors former property lines and fields. Very quickly, this is the process of growth. So this would be one fedan. They are usually subdivided in smaller units that are called kirats, which would be 12 by 14 meters. And owners would sell these particular pieces and some construction would appear. And the canals that actually, so these are irrigation canals for water. And the canals that lead to these particular spots would be fields so that you can actually create an access road. The buildings multiply and start to affect the agrarian practices. As land prices go up and agriculture become less profitable, you don't have water anymore, and then you start to have shade from the neighboring buildings. Tenants would get evicted, and finally the entire fedan is constructed and the area is urbanized. You would maybe have a few agrarian residues. So this is the same area in the same neighborhood. It's in Ardileba. It's a plot of farmland. So in 2003, it would be this plot here, for instance. And you see that it's already at the edge of this new informal urbanization. And this is the same plot today. And it's just one of the few residual agricultural pockets. And I want to conclude with the farmer of this plot. He's in a very precarious situation. He has been working this land for over 50 years, but his children don't want to farm. He doesn't own the land, and he knows that it's only a matter of time until the real estate value in the area will convince the landowner to sell and force him out. And his field, I'll show you a picture right after, stands in the shade of the neighboring building and gets trash from the street. So he only grows animal feed. And the main reason why he's still able to farm this plot is because there is a well on the property and he can irrigate it early. So his case is somehow symptomatic of the situation in Greater Cairo, with farming population facing the impact of the loss of agrarian land. And these actors that are involved in food production in these areas do not have the means to resist against the ongoing pressure of urban extension. So here is his field. Sorry, I'm just trying to get back my mouse. Yes. So this chronicled record of lost land follows political regimes, economic ideologies, and institutional transformations, and the changes to the rural world that have been brought about in a successive fashion, one supplanting the other. The commodification of agrarian land and the disciplining of the population. The integration into the global economy, social land redistribution and power shifts, and liberalization and privatization processes, all of which have contributed to a constantly shifting territorial organization. This inspection of arable lands taken by colonial forces, by wealthy landlords, by new ruling classes and peasants, by urbanization and neoliberal diktats show how colonial legal tools, land tenure reforms, agrarian projects, and other licit frameworks uncover agrarian fertile land, indissociable from the value of its soil, as one of the most powerful tools for social and political control over territory, resources, population, nutrition, and class. Thank you.